Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Luan. I'm from the University of Nevada, Reno, and I'm going to be your instructor today for the third installment in your class, and this is Designing Experimental Research in ABA Part 3. And today we're going to be talking about social validity. I thought I would start off with a little Jigo Shokai to introduce myself. I got my start in behavior analysis working in an institution for adults with developmental disabilities in Arizona in the late 1990s, and that was a really interesting time, at least in Arizona, because at that time they were closing the institution. So for many years, individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities all lived on the same campus, and I came on right as they were moving them out of the institutions out into the community in group homes. And so it was interesting to watch that happen. And so I had this experience, met a behavior analyst there, and I knew that's kind of what I wanted to do, but I also had always wanted to travel. So I went to Japan as an English teacher for 3 years, and I lived on Kyushu in Kumamoto-ken, Kikuchi-shi, teaching at Shogako, Chugako, and even some Hoikuen stuff. But Kikuchi was famous for its gorge here. You can see in the upper right-hand corner this beautiful waterfalls. Below that picture is Kikuchi-kun. He's the town mascot. You can see he has a big melon on his head because that part of Kumamoto is famous for its melon. So it was fun to be there. I learned Kumamoto Ben, so they say it's hot, Atsuka, Ate lots of basashi, so that was a wonderful experience. After that, I returned to the United States, did graduate training, and during my graduate training, I worked for several years doing home-based early intensive behavioral intervention services for young children with autism. So we were doing, in-home services with children and their families for 30 or 40 hours a week when they're preschool age. And then more recently, I've been working in the school district here in Reno, doing school-based behavioral consultation, and consultation just meaning that we don't do too much work with the students directly. Rather, we see our role as training teachers and aides in the classroom to interact with students in a different way. So I kind of have a variety of different applied experiences that I'll bring to bear on today's subject matter. These days, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. I currently oversee 8 master's and doctoral students in their research, and that's a picture of us. You can see we have a very young lab member. One of my students just had her first child, and so he comes to lab, and when he's presenting, when somebody is presenting, he's pounding on the table when he really likes something that somebody says. My work at the university, I kind of am doing 2 different things. On the one hand, like I said, I'm working in schools, so we work in school districts with teachers and aides who work with the students who have the most severe problem behaviors, and so we train the teachers to sort of manage behavior, collect data, those sorts of things. We also work with parents sometimes. And then also, I have a picture down here on the bottom right of one of my little buddies. We work with mice, and we study basic learning principles and processes and animal models of human conditions. So I kind of have, my training has been both in the applied world and then basic research. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. With that being said, we'll move on into the lecture. It's nice to meet you. I wish I could see you face to face, but yoroshiku onegai itashimasu. Okay, so let's start at the beginning here, which is our main topic. So as I mentioned, this lecture at least, is about social validity. And social validity, we'll talk about what it means here in just a minute. But social validity is something that kind of developed within the field of behavior analysis a little bit later than other things. So in the upper right hand corner here, you can see the seminal, kind of the first appearance of the importance of social validity in applied behavior analysis. This was by the famous behavior analyst Mont Wolf. And the paper is called Social Validity, or the Case for Subjective Measurement. And so this is 1978. If you think that, the earliest sorts of writings and research in applied behavior analysis was happening in the 60s, this is almost the 80s. So social validity is kind of something that has been a more recent development within the field. And here in a few minutes, I'll talk about why I think that is the case. But for now, let's lay out our definition here. What is social validity? Well, first, it's the extent to which treatment goals, treatment methods, and treatment outcomes are deemed acceptable and important to all stakeholders. So when we say stakeholders, we of course mean the person who is receiving the services, the recipient of services, but stakeholders include their parents, right? Because their parents are involved in the services we provide, school personnel, and then, even larger sense, society at large. So does the society or the culture in which you are providing behavior analytics services, do they find the services that you are providing valuable, right? So social validity covers all of those areas. So like I mentioned, I kind of want to talk about where did this idea come from? And I think that some historical context is useful here. So you probably know that applied behavior analysis, as it exists today, originally developed from laboratory research, and particularly laboratory research with non-human animals, so pigeons and rats. All of Skinner's research, B.F. Skinner's research, was in his Behavior of Organisms book, which was his first sort of attempt to lay out his system of thinking about things. That was all done with white rats. And then he moved on to pigeons. So the origins of our science comes from laboratory research, which I think is relevant. Like I mentioned, the applications of these principles that were being discovered in the laboratory started to be applied to humans in applied settings, real-world settings, in the 1950s and the 60s. And one of the earliest studies that is always cited as one of the first ABA studies was done by Allen and Jack Michael in 1959. And the citation is in the upper right-hand corner here. But what they did in this study was they went into an institution, a psychiatric hospital, and they trained the nurses to implement extinction procedures for some of the people who lived in the hospital at that time. So one thing I want to point out here, I mentioned that I got my start working in an institution for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And if you look at a lot of the earliest ABA studies, they were working with institutionalized populations. So they were working with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities or neuropsychiatric disorders in very controlled circumstances where they kind of could control the whole environment. And I think that part of our history is one of the reasons why we've been so long in thinking about social validity. I think that there are some implications of the fact that the earliest ABA interventions were conducted with institutionalized populations, and I'll lay some of those out here. First, they were working with very severe, aggressive, and self-injurious behaviors. So, like I said, I worked in one of these institutions. I saw, these were grown adults. And so some of these behaviors, these aggressive or self injurious behaviors, had been developed across 30 or 40 years. And they were incredibly intense. My original mentor, the guy who introduced me to behavior analysis, he mentioned that he got his start working in the 1960s and the 70s in institutions, and he said that the reason behavior analysts were accepted into the institutions as professionals at that time was that they were able to work with these really intense behaviors, right? So that's one thing, that one implication of coming from this place. Second, behavior analysts working in institutional settings have almost absolute control over the environments. So, if you are doing applied work now, you're probably not working in an institution. You're either working with a child in their home or in a school. Maybe you're working at a center, and at a center you have a little more control over what's happening. But if you're working in a home, there's all sorts of different things happening. Mom's home, dad's home, the brothers and sisters are running around, maybe grandma and grandpa come over for a visit. It's kind of wild, right? So you don't have as much control. But the earliest ABA sort of research were in these settings where they did have a lot of control. Third, there was an absence largely of self-advocacy. What I mean here is that the populations with whom these early behavior analysts were working were with populations that could not advocate for themselves and say, hey, I don't like this. This isn't in line with what I prefer. And in a larger sense, one of the features of living in institutions is that there tends to be a lack of advocacy for that population by others. So that's one of the reasons why they closed the institutions, is that they live in this place, nobody sees them, and they don't really see what's going on, and nobody is sort of speaking up for them and saying, hey, have you thought about the recipient of services preferences in these areas? Fourth, there's a kind of a lack of oversight when you're working in an institution, in that, of course, you have people come through for quality audits and things like that, but it's not the same as working in a school, for example, because when you do stuff in the school with your learner, everybody sees it, and that's not the same case in the institution, where it's not able to be seen by a lot of people. And then lastly, the last implication of working with these institutionalized populations early in ABA research are these what are now called colonial cultural assumptions. And what this means is just that there's a tendency for people who are professionals, especially in the psychological or psychiatric domains, that the doctor knows best, right? I have been trained, so I know what's best for you. And that sort of attitude has prevailed not just in behavior analysis, it's prevailed in all of the helping services. This idea that you know what's better for your client than maybe they do, right? And in some cases, there's some truth to that, but the whole point of the rest of this course is going to be that there is great value in taking your learner's preferences into consideration when you're designing interventions and assessments. So in the previous slide, I mentioned some reasons why I think that social validity has taken so long to become an important concern in applied behavior analysis. Like I mentioned, it kind of developed later than other things. There are a couple of reasons, I think. let's say this. So I'll back up here. Um, Early applied behavior analysis, like I said, they were moving from the laboratory to the applied world. So, we're working with pigeons and rats. Are the things that we are seeing in the laboratory, can we use them to help people in the real world? And so I think for that reason, early ABA was just more concerned with, like, do these things work with humans? So they were less concerned with sort of how people felt about it, whether they liked it or not, and just as, does this actually work? And the early evidence was, yes, this does work, which was really exciting and still is exciting. I think sometimes even I forget how exciting that must have been for them to take these principles and find that behavior was lawful in the real world just like it was in the laboratory. But I think, again, the effect of this was that they were more concerned about changing behavior rather than how people felt about it. I think that another reason why social validity was kind of slow to come about was that there has always been in our field a reluctance or wariness of subjective measures. So when we're talking about social validity, we're essentially trying to determine if people think our services are important and acceptable. And so we're asking them to, did you like this? And so that's a self-report measure. And there's always been a little bit of suspicion in behavior analysis about these sorts of measures of behavior because they're not real measures of behavior change. But that's not true. How people evaluate things is just as important of a behavior as some of the other ones that we target for change with our interventions. One of the things that I think led to the emergence of social validity is that once you start taking your science and using it with people in the real world, their preferences start to become an important part of that. And so a lot of us call the people who receive our services consumers, right? And so, when somebody is consuming a service, how they feel about it, how they evaluate, how they see the value of it, right, starts to become an important consideration. And you don't have to worry about that in the institution. You don't have to ask them. They're getting the services whether they want them or not. In the real world, in the modern world, that is not the case, right? People need to feel good about the services that they're getting. They need to have a role in the services they're getting. So to return to our definition here, I want to break it down into its three parts and kind of discuss one by one. So this part of the lecture, we're like, okay, what are we talking about here? On the right-hand side of the screen here are several sort of important references that you can read to get more information from the scholarly community about where social validity came from. So, right, there are three domains of social validity. One is in treatment goals. And this includes the target behavior selection. So which target behaviors are you going to choose to intervene upon? So we know that selecting the right target behaviors is important, but this is important for social validity in the sense that the people that you work with, the stakeholders, right? So the recipient of services, their families, their schools, if you're working in schools, and their communities, they all have to feel that the behaviors that you are working with are of importance. So you're not going to pick small little behaviors that have no importance to everybody else. You're picking behaviors that everybody values in the community. Related to this is picking the behavioral objective or goals. So let's say you're working with a student in a school and they engage in behavior 100% of the day. And so you're working with a teacher and you're trying to figure out a goal. right? It probably is not very valuable to the teacher if you reduce that behavior to where it's only happening 80% of the day, right? That's not much of a difference. So, in other words, the goals, the outcome, right? What you're kind of going for with your intervention have to be thought of as important too. The second area in which you want to assess social validity is treatment methods. So is the method that you're using going to be seen as acceptable and or important to the stakeholders? One of the things that I run that, if you've done this work, you recognize that people feel are a lot more likely to see reinforcement procedures as acceptable relative to extinction procedures, right? Extinction procedures can look bad. For instance, if a child's tantruming is maintained by attention, you say ignore it, there's an extinction burst, it looks bad, right? So in general, reinforcement-based procedures tend to have more social validity than extinction ones. But there are other things in the treatment methods. It's like when, where, and how often treatment occurs. So let's say you're working in a school, or and you're saying I need to be in there to treat the student for 3 hours per day. You can imagine the reaction to the school officials and be like, no way, this child has to be at recess, they have to go to lunch, etc. So choosing when, where, and how treatment occurs is an important part of social validity. And then also another feature of treatment methods is how you speak to your stakeholders about the treatments that you're recommending. So there's been a lot of, and we'll talk about this later in the lecture, there's a lot of things happening in behavior analysis now where it's like you have to use non-technical language when you're speaking to the stakeholders. So for example, if you're trying to convince a parent to implement some procedure, you're not going to use technical language. You're not going to say, well, you need to differentially reinforce this behavior and then place this behavior on extinction, right? No, you're going to say, like, when the kid does this, I want you to give them a hug and give them some food, and when they do this stuff, like just kind of, try to walk away for a minute until they give you something, you speak about it in a different way with your stakeholders, and that contributes to social validity. And the last domain of social validity is treatment outcomes. So item A here is what are you aiming for? Item C, treatment outcomes here, is what is the actual result of treatment? What actually came about? And so something that's really important here is choosing a measurement system that really shows that you have accomplished something that's of importance, right? So you have to think about social validity in choosing how you're going to measure behavior. And ideally, this doesn't happen as much as I think it does. We need to think about, as a field, how can we measure changes in quality of life of our consumers, right? So let's say we taught them to imitate 50 different responses, right? Well, who cares? Is that meaningful? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't, right? But we need to have measures of those. So that's something that we'll talk about here towards the end. The second part, right? So, treatment goals, treatment methods, treatment outcomes, all of those involve social validity. And it's the extent to which stakeholders find them acceptable and important, right? So what are we talking about? What does this mean? Well, in the most general sense, acceptability means that stakeholders say, yeah, they allow you to implement a plan of action that you recommend. So sometimes this is said in English as buy-in, right? So in other words, yes, okay, I believe that this is going to work. I believe that this is important. Let's do it. Right? So that is acceptability. Importance is the extent to which stakeholders view your plan as meaningful. In other words, you're targeting some behaviors that are meaningful, and that are going, if your intervention is successful, it's going to make an important improvement in your learners, your consumers' lives. I want to point out here that efficacy is a different measure than acceptability and importance. So, for example, you could have an intervention that all the stakeholders like, and they're like, yes, go do it. So it has acceptability. The stakeholders agree that it is important. Yes, we think that this procedure is going to bring about a meaningful change in my child's life, or my my student's life. But efficacy is a whole different ballgame, right? Because efficacy is, does a behavior change procedure actually change behavior, right? That is efficacy. So you could have a behavior change procedure that is effective, it has efficacy, but it does not have acceptability or importance, in that, the stakeholders don't think it's important, and they don't think that maybe the methods that you used to get that outcome were acceptable, right? On the other hand, you could have a program that stakeholders really like, and they think it's really important, but it's not actually effective in the end. And so your job is tough here, in that you have to balance those things. I'll tell you a story. This is my wife. She'll be teaching part 4 of this class. Ainsley, you'll meet her here next week. She did a program where she was teaching a young child with autism to wait. So in other words, when he asked for a treat, some food, the parents wanted the child to be able to wait for a little bit for snacks and things like this. And so, Ainsley did this procedure, and the data showed that it was not effective in teaching the child to wait, but the parents thought it was very acceptable and very important, right? And so that's just the point here, is that sometimes your stakeholders will think that you're doing, they feel great social validity, there's a high degree of social validity of your procedures, but they're not effective. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind here. The last component here of social validity is that your methods, your goals, your outcomes are acceptable and important to all stakeholders. And so again, stakeholders include the recipients of service. These are often overlooked in social validity. We'll talk about that more here later. Parents, family, caregivers, and an important part of social validity with these stakeholders are cultural considerations. So you have to kind of think about, what does the family itself value? If you're working in schools, stakeholders include school personnel, such as teachers and principals. And then, as I mentioned, the community and society. So you have to be thinking about, does teaching this skill, is it important to the community, the larger community to which the consumer is, of which the consumer is a part? So, why is it important? Why are we talking about social validity? One is that there are some ethical reasons for considering consumer preferences. We'll talk about these here in a moment. Second is that consumer emotional responses to or evaluation of ABA services is important, in the sense that if you start working with a child or a family and your services are not seen to be socially valid, not seen to be important or acceptable, it's likely that they're going to stop receiving your services. They're going to drop out and go look for services elsewhere. So there's a practical reason to be interested in social validity. related to this, as I just mentioned, sometimes my slides come up and I said the thing I was on the slide already. Interventions with social validity are more likely to be effective, right? So when you have everybody on board with what you're asking them to do, it's more likely that they're gonna do it. So I think of like if you're trying to teach a parent how to react to their children's undesirable behaviors, if they feel like it's acceptable and important, they're more likely to follow your recommendations. So I mentioned that there are some ethical reasons for why social validity is important. I know that the BACB has stopped certifying individuals, behavior analysts outside of the United States, but I think it is informative to look at the ethics code just briefly, because if you're in the United States and you have to be certified to practice as a behavior analyst, and to be certified you are held to this ethics code. And I think that just briefly looking at some of the features of the ethics code is informative as to sort of our responsibilities with social validity. So one of the things is that behavior analysts have a responsibility to be responsive to the culture of the consumers with whom they are working. And not just the culture, but things like age, disability, ethnicity, gender expression, or identity. All of those things have to be respected by the behavior analyst. And so these are things that have to be considered when you're thinking about social validity. Another one here is that behavior analysts must be aware of their personal biases and challenges. So we all come from our own unique personal and cultural backgrounds. And one of our roles as behavior analysts is to try not to impose too much of our own personal biases on our consumers. Another one here is to avoid coercive and exploitative relationships. So I mentioned this colonial attitude where I'm the doctor, I know what's best. If you don't like my services, then you don't get my service. That's not what we're trying to do. That's against ethical guidelines, right? We avoid coercing our consumers into making decisions. Rather, we should be collaborating with them. We communicate about our services. So I mentioned, so how do you talk to your consumers about the services you're providing are important. 2.09 here on the right hand side is involving clients and stakeholders. So gone are the days where I say everything that is going to happen. We collaborate with our consumers to decide on what our treatment goals and methods are going to be. And then lastly, you take care to let the consumer know, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's how it's going to work. Here's how it's going to play out, right? So all of these things are relevant to social validity. So I just mentioned this because social validity is just baked into everything that you're doing. And that will be discussed here in more detail in a little bit later. Now I want to spend just a moment talking about some of the differences between social validity in ABA research versus practice. And so I think that the focus of this course is technically research. But I think that many of the considerations of social validity in practice can help inform how you use or how you might use social validity in your research. So ABA research has some characteristics that distinguish it from practice. So in ABA research, you have relatively controlled and contrived situations. So your environment is very, very structured for experimental control purposes. In ABA research, the goal, it's aimed at demonstrating relations between your independent variable, which is your intervention, and your dependent variable, which is some measure of the target behaviors. Because of this, the research here, and there are studies you can see on the right here. In research, social validity has tended to only really be assessed at the very end of an experiment, and usually as a secondary measure. So, in other words, in most ABA research, they have an intervention, they do it, and does it change behavior, yes or no? And then at the end, they give them a social validity questionnaire. Did you find this acceptable? Blah, blah, blah. Right? So it's not often seen in research as a major measure, it's a secondary one. So it's like at the end of it, did you like it? Okay, great. Okay, fine. But even more than this, a lot of studies don't measure social validity at all. So these two papers that I have on the right hand side of the screen were done recently, and both of them said that social validity is, there are still so many studies that are being conducted where they just don't even assess social validity. And for me, I think this is problematic because, as I've suggested, social validity could be considered an important dependent variable. In other words, an important outcome in its own right, right? So, what sorts of practices can we do that promote or increase social validity? There are a ton of experiments that you could do on that. And so I said, maybe this is a project for you. Maybe you start to make social validity your concern. So that's a little bit different. Social validity in research is different than social validity in practice. So in ABA practice, right, you're not doing an experiment, you're trying to help people, right? You're trying to solve a problem. So you're working in real world situations. There are many interacting uncontrollable factors affect behavior in a way that they don't in an experiment. So there are lots of things that you can't control in the real world. Second is there's no need for experimental control in practice, right? You're not trying to demonstrate a functional relationship between your independent and dependent variables in the real world. You're just trying to solve a problem. So anything that achieves your treatment goals quickly is good enough, right? And as sometimes if you've had these experiences, behavior changes and it could be due to 1 to 3 different things and you're not sure which one it is, but you don't really care in practice because the outcome was obtained, right? Now, sometimes you have to pick it apart and act a little bit like you're running an experiment, but in most cases, you just want the outcome, and that's what you're shooting for. In practice, social validity is not just an outcome measure. In other words, it's not just something that you do at the very end and say, hey, so did you like that? Right? I'm gonna suggest later in the lecture here that social validity is something that should be happening at every stage in the treatment process, and we'll talk about like how you can incorporate that into your work. Before we go on to the second portion of this lecture, I'd like to take a moment to pause here. And I would like, 90 minutes is a long time to sit through an online lecture. So I'd like you to take a moment, get up, stretch your legs. But while you're doing so, I'd like you to stop and reflect for a moment and honestly do this, if you would, for me. Think about, and if you're if you're watching this with somebody else, maybe you guys can spend a minute to reflect. In what ways have you considered or incorporated your learners' preferences in your work? And then could you do more of this? So think about that for a few moments. Get up, stretch your legs, maybe get some coffee or some ocha or something like that, and then we'll move on to the next part. Hi, welcome back. So let's now move into the second part of this lecture. And this is how to. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that social validity is important. We need more of it in research, and it's something that should inform every step of the treatment process when you're working with consumers. So how do we do it? How do we assess social validity? So one of the recommended readings for this lecture is Common and Lane social validity assessments. So I'm going to be going over some of that information here and kind of adding my own flair where I can. So the most common way and easiest way to assess social validity are these, like I mentioned, these self-report rating scales. And so these are questionnaires, surveys, or interviews. And here on the screen now is from Common and Lane, a table showing all of the different rating scales that have been validated empirically. In other words, they have been used in research and tested. So if you're interested in social validity in research, using one of these empirically validated instruments, social validity rating skills, is probably something good to think about, because your reviewers will ask you, well, why did you use this method versus that one? And if you use one of these empirically validated ones, it's been empirically validated. So self-report rating scales are not just limited to those ones on this table, though, and that's the point I kind of want to make here, is that so it involves surveys, it could be interviews, it could be questionnaires, right? So all of those are self-report rating scales in the sense that you're asking someone else about the importance and acceptability of the goals, the methods, and the outcomes, right? So any of those methods can be used, and you can develop your own social validity methods. So in practice, I think it's usually better to create your own questionnaire. That way you can ask very specific questions related to the intervention and the setting that you're working in. And you can also develop your own methods for research too. And I think in some cases that's warranted, but like I said, you might get the question from a reviewer, why did you use your own social validity assessment? Why didn't you use one of these empirically validated one? If you have a good reason for that, then I think that it's important to develop some of these that are not just using the tools, right? One thing to kind of keep in mind here is the sort of the benefits and limitation of open-ended versus closed-ended questions. So open-ended questions are an example would be, how did you like this intervention, right? And it's open-ended in that the person can just tell you whatever they want to tell you. And so that's good, you tend to get different kinds of information from that, but they're hard to score. Close-ended questions are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being unacceptable and 5 being very acceptable. Circle how you felt about this intervention, right? So you see the difference between open-ended and closed-ended. Open-ended, you let the person answer however they want. Closed-ended, you limit the answers that a person can give to you. And so this table here, table 1 from Freiling and Byra's 2016, shows the strengths and the limitation of closed and open-ended assessments. And so you want to think about what your treatment context or your research context is in selecting between closed or open-ended. Like I said, closed-ended are easy to score because they give you a number. And so you can average, well, 80, they picked 4 on 5 of the question, right? It's easily quantifiable, whereas open-ended ones, they can say whatever you want, and then you have to figure out how to categorize those answers, right? One thing to always keep in mind in any sort of self-reporting situation are reactivity. So one is you have to imagine that you hand the person, somebody, one of the stakeholders, your questionnaire. Already they may not be totally truthful in answering the questions on the questionnaires because it's coming from you, the service provider or the researcher, right? You are a part of that situation, and so there is a tendency for people in questionnaires to maybe not necessarily answer what they truly think, and answer maybe what they think you want them to report, right? So those things always have to be you have to be careful with that. And related to that is the issue of validity. So just because somebody says they really liked an intervention doesn't necessarily mean that they did for the reasons that I just mentioned. So none of those are things that, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use self-report scales, but when you do use them, you have to acknowledge these features of them, so you don't, in other words, you're remembering that these are self-reports, right? I think that's just important to keep in mind. A second method of assessing social validity is a group of procedures called direct assessment. So questionnaires, self-reporting scales, those are indirect. Those are called indirect in that you're asking people about something. Whereas in direct assessment techniques, like we're talking about here, you actually go in and measure something that is related to social validity. And so Common and Lane offer several examples. The first being normative comparison. In normative comparison, you identify peers, peers of your learner who are either highly competent or expert performers in the skill that you're trying to teach, or who are just representative. In other words, they're typical of the environmental context. So I'll give you a couple of examples about how this might work. But you get a peer, and then you take some measure of behavior in your consumer or your learner, and you compare it to that peer. I'll give you two examples. So example one here, comparison to an expert performer. So let's say that you're interested in the child that you're working with can read, but they read slowly. And you're trying to think about, okay, what is the appropriate reading speed or level for my learner? One way that you could do this is to find a child who is like the best in their class and how quickly they read. And so you could identify that child, and then they're an expert in the sense that of the students in that classroom, they are considered fluent readers. You measure their performance to see roughly how many words per minute they read, and then you measure performance in your learner. And so you see, oh, well, it appears that this highly competent, fluent reader reads, let's say, I don't know, 100 words a minute, but my learner reads 20. So that gives you some idea of where you need to go with your intervention. And then you would use your behavior change principles to gradually shape up words read per minute until it approximates the expert level. So that's one approach you could take. A second approach you could take is to find a peer in the setting who is representative, who's normal, who's typical. What's typical of a child in a classroom, for example? And then you measure their behavior and compare it to your learner to kind of see where your learner sits relative to other typical individuals in that setting. So here on the right hand side of the screen is a data sheet broken into 10-second intervals. And this is something that we've used when I worked with in the autism program and we were bringing children from home into schools, is to see how engaged our children were relative to the other children in the classroom. So what we did is we used momentary time sampling. So every 10 seconds we'd have a little timer. And so every 10 seconds we would look up from our data sheet and we would look at our learner and we would look at the peer, right? And so we would record, was our learner engaged on task? If it was, we circled E. If they were not on task, we circled N for not engaged. And we did that for both our child and the peer every 10 seconds, right? And so, let's say these are our data for our target, our learner, and we can see that at the first 10 seconds we look up and they were engaged. At 20 seconds we looked up, they were not. Then they were engaged for the consecutive interval, and then they were not, right? And so this gives you, well, my child, the person I'm working with was engaged 5 out of 12 intervals on task. So they were on task only 42% of the time. So maybe if you don't have a peer to compare to, you might think that's really terrible. It's like, gosh, it's less than 50%. My child is not doing well. But the important part is you compare to a standard peer. And when you look at the peer, you're taking these same measurements in the same setting. That child is only engaged 6 out of 12 times, so 50%. And so there's not much of a difference. And this is an important thing, right? Because if you just looked at your child without comparing it to other children, your child to other children in the setting, you might think that you need to work on this. But maybe all the children in the classroom are about at this level, and that's maybe what you want for your learner. So related to that issue, it's really important if you're using normative comparison to choose the person to whom you are comparing your learner very thoughtfully. Some questions that you want to ask yourself in this situation. Is expert level performance necessary or even appropriate for your learner and the skill that you're teaching? So for example, to go back to the example of words read per minute, is it necessary that your child read as quickly as this expert in the class? The answer sometimes may be yes, but the answer may sometimes be no. No, they don't need to read that fast. They maybe just need to read as fast as, kind of the average child in that classroom. Secondly, are peer levels of performance sufficient, or does your learner need to do better than peers? So to go back to the example of on task, we saw that the peer that we used was on task only 50% of the time, which was roughly equivalent to our learner. The question is that good enough, right? Just because our learner looks like some other kid in the classroom may not be good enough. Maybe we want our learner to be better than the average child in that classroom for some reason. But these are questions to be asking yourself, right? You don't need your kid to be on task 100% of the time necessarily, but maybe 50% is not enough, right? And this is context specific. In other words, so just to kind of wrap this up, matching experts and peers may not be appropriate for your learner, right? So sometimes for one of the reasons that I just discussed, peer comparison isn't a good measure, right? And so just ask yourself this question when you're thinking about it. In addition to normative comparison, a second direct assessment technique for social validity is consumer preference assessment. So checking in some way with your consumer to determine if what you're doing is within their preferences. a lot of you are familiar with this practice, which is to identify preferred items and activities. So it's really hard to teach a skill if you don't have an effective reinforcer. And so preference assessments, there's a large body of literature on how to do preference assessments, like single stimulus, paired choice, multiple stimulus with and without replacement, etc., right? So there are many methods for assessing preference in terms of what might be a reinforcer. And so that's an important part of social validity, because if you're working with a kid, if you have powerful reinforcers, chances are they're going to, find what you're doing socially valid, right? Less frequently used is a method to allow the consumer to choose the teaching method that you use. And so this citation here on the right by Dr. Hanley, I think that what he did in this, I know that what he did in this study was that he would put, these were, children with intellectual disabilities. And so he put a red card and a green card. And when the kid picked the red card, they would teach using discrete trials. And then if the child picked the green card, they would teach with natural environment teaching. I don't know if that's true, but it's just an example, right? And so if you keep that up, the child may come to always pick the red card because they prefer to learn the task with this teaching method versus that one, right? So you can get creative with these sorts of things and see if your learner prefers a particular teaching style relative to another. Another one that isn't mentioned in the literature, but something that we used to do in the autism program, is allow the child to choose the order of programs or tasks that they completed. So we had one child who really didn't like working on facial recognition, emotion recognition. So that was hard for him. And every time that program would come up in a session, there tended to be some interfering behaviors like tantrums or running away and things. He really didn't like that program. It was hard, which I understand. And so one of the things that we tried was just to let him select when in the session that he did his program. So we would start the session and he's like, okay, we're going to do this one first, this one second, this one third. And just allowing him the choice of when we ran a particular program decreased some of the interfering behaviors that we were seeing. So you can get creative in a lot of different ways in incorporating your learners' preferences and choice in the work that you do with them. There are some considerations to keep in mind when you're assessing consumer preference. One is, of course, to assess preference frequently, because preferences change, especially for children, right? So what's reinforcing now in 30 minutes may not be anymore, and that's even more so the case. What's reinforcing today may not be reinforcing on Friday, right? Second, use a preference assessment method that's appropriate to your learner. So some of the children that we work with in school are visually impaired, and so they can't really see the items very well in a preference assessment. And so we've had to make modifications to make where they are able to touch them and hear them instead of just relying on sight. So you have to think about your learner's skill levels and abilities when you're developing your preference assessments or your procedure assessments. And this is important and I think overlooked. You have to allow your learner to sample the options. We can't prefer what we've never experienced. And so in the example of, you could have a child choose between discrete trials teaching and natural environment teaching, but that choice is not bound to be meaningful unless the child has had multiple opportunities to experience both options. And the same is true with reinforcers. Some things that may be really powerful reinforcers a child has never experienced before, and so you have to give them the option to to see it, like, okay, what's it like to bounce on the trampoline before the child gets the chance to choose it. That's really important in getting a more accurate readout of what your consumer's preference is. A third direct assessment technique is sustained use. So imagine you are training a caregiver, a parent, or a teacher to use a behavioral technique. Let's say non-contingent reinforcement. Let's just use that as an example. So you're training the teacher to use this procedure. A good measure of social validity, or the perceived acceptability or importance of that intervention, is that the person continues to use it after you've trained them. So if you've been in the field long enough, we've all had the experience where we spend a lot of time training a teacher or a parent or somebody else how to do something with the child, and we come back 2 weeks later and they're not doing it anymore. That's a pretty good measure that's a pretty good indication that what you did was not deemed socially valid for some reason or another. However, if you see that, that they continue to use this procedure that you've trained them in long after you trained them, that's a good measure, on the other hand, that it is socially valid, right? In other words, the proof is in the pudding, we say, we have this saying. It also can be measured, social validity can be measured in this way by treatment integrity or procedural fidelity. I think you've talked about this in your other classes, but the extent to which they do it right and keep doing it right. And so if they are sticking to the plan and doing it correctly with high fidelity, chances are it's deemed socially valid by them. Related to this, a fourth direct assessment technique is maintenance of behavior change. So after you've attained some treatment goal with a consumer, you see that behavior change that you brought about through intervention is maintained across time. That's a really good indication that the goals you selected were socially valid, in that they were appropriate to the learner as well as the learner's environment, right? Because behaviors that we teach in intervention have to be maintained in the natural environment after we're done. Otherwise, they're not socially valid because they're not important, right? Nothing has changed outside of the treatment setting, right? So those are all different direct assessment techniques. A third social validity assessment method, as mentioned in Common and Lane, is external evaluation. So in this sense, you have experts, so a colleague who's trained as a behavior analyst, or other stakeholders evaluate either the intervention or its outcome. So in the case of the intervention, you could describe or show the intervention strategies to your stakeholders, and they can observe it and choose, like, okay, I prefer this way of doing it versus that one. Or you could have them watch it and then rate it, use one of those rating scales. You could also allow stakeholders to observe some treatment outcome and rate its acceptability or importance. So for example, in the autism program, at the very end, we took a video of a child having a conversation with their mother, right? And so this video was then viewed and, do you think this is a good outcome, sort of thing, right? So in other words, you allow somebody else who is not you or the consumer to sort of look at it and rate the extent to which they find it acceptable in the terms of treatment methods or important. So just to review here, social validity assessment methods fall into 3 general categories. The first are indirect methods. In this method, stakeholders just report their views of social validity. So you're taking a self-report measure of the importance and the acceptability of your goals, methods, and outcomes. The second is direct methods. And so this describes methods where you directly measure some aspect of behavior. So you're not just relying on people's opinions, you're measuring the behavior of your learner relative to something else. And then lastly is external evaluation. It's similar to indirect methods in that you're using self-report. So you're having somebody look at it and say, yes, that is socially valued. But it may also include non-stakeholder experts. So you may have a colleague look at an outcome and say, is this important? So those are kind of the major self-assessment or social validity assessment methods. And now we are here at the end of the second section of this lecture. And so another opportunity to stretch your legs and get a drink and self-reflect again. And so relevant to what we just talked about, I want you to think about, and if you're with somebody you can speak with, discuss, am I measuring social validity in my work? Right? So are you making any efforts to assess social validity? If so, are there ways that you could make it better? And if not, how might you do so? So if you're not assessing social validity, think about some of the things that we just talked about. What would be feasible or possible for you? Think about those for a moment, and then we'll go on to the final section here. Okay, hope you were able to kind of shake it off a little bit. And here we are in our last section. So we've talked about what social validity is, kind of a historical context for how it came about, why it's important. In the last section, we talked about how to do it, what are the assessment methods, and in this final section, I want to just talk about some general considerations. So one thing that I mentioned is that in ABA research, social validity tends to be assessed at the very end of some treatment. But in practice in particular, and I would argue in research too, social validity is something that is relevant to all steps of the treatment process. So in all phases of treatment, you need to take steps to promote social validity because it's important for you to be able to achieve your goals working with your consumer, right? You need social validity for that to happen. And you have to assess for social validity throughout the treatment process and not just at the end. So how do we do this? How do you promote social validity throughout and assess social validity throughout the treatment process? Well, I'm going to give you several ideas, but one thing that is just so important that I cannot stress enough is building rapport. Okay? So building rapport in behavioral terms, we talk about rapport, you just have a good relationship with somebody, right? You get along. These are the ways that we speak about it in casual terms. But in technical terms, building rapport with stakeholders sort of entails a couple of things. One is just having repeated reinforcing interactions. So when you start working with a family or a child, the first thing that you do, you don't start going in there and start training right away. You spend some time building rapport, and that involves having repeated reinforcing interactions with that individual, right? If you're working with a child, you find some of the things that they like to do and you just do them with that kid. You hang out and you build Legos and, you throw the ball or you run outside, whatever the child likes to do, you just hang out with them and do that. If you're talking about rapport with parents or teachers, you just talk to them. What did you do this weekend? Oh my gosh, it's been so hot. What are you up to? What are your hobbies? These sorts of things. These sorts of just being, having pleasant interactions with people. At the same time, when you're building rapport, you're trying to minimize aversive interactions. And some of those are demands, right? So again, if you're working with a child for the first time, first day, you're not going to go in and start making them do all these tough programs. You're going to spend maybe the first day or two just having fun with them, right? You're not going to place demands too many demands that might be aversive. And when you do start bringing in demands, you bring them in slowly, right? Same thing with parents. You're not going to come in and the first day, you need to do this, that, right? You start by just sort of being a good person and hanging out with them. And then gradually you start to ask them to do a little bit more across time. An important part of building rapport too with your stakeholders is say-do correspondence. And I know there is a literature in behavior analysis of teaching children say-do correspondence, but it's not often talked about enough, I think, in terms of social validity, that when you say you're going to show up, that you're there, right? When you say you're going to run this program, you do. When you say you're going to give the parents the data, you do. In other words, everything that you say you're going to do, you do. And that's a really important part of building rapport, which is an important part of social validity more generally. When you are able to build rapport in this way, the outcomes are that you establish yourself as a reinforcer, as a conditioned reinforcer. And that means that your praise and your feedback is more likely to be reinforcing. So we all know that when we get praise from somebody who we find reinforcing, that praise functions as reinforcing, right? And the feedback that you give them is reinforcing, and it makes it less likely that your requests, because you're going to have to request the child to do things, the parents to do things. It makes it less likely that these requests or these recommendations are going to function as aversive for them, right? They're going to, speaking colloquially, they're going to trust you. They're going to trust your judgment and go along with it. So, for the next couple of slides here, a student and I wrote a paper about the importance of social validity in schools. And so that's down in the bottom right-hand corner here. And so I'm not going to speak specifically about schools here, but a lot of these recommendations for incorporating, how to build social validity and how to assess for it throughout the treatment process are relevant to it's not just schools, in other words. So one area that's important is in communication. So I mentioned that how you speak to your stakeholders is an important part of the social validity of the treatment that you provide. So you want to try and use non-technical language, and then you want to consider and incorporate stakeholder values. So when you're speaking about how treatment is progressing, you want to have some understanding ideally of what that family or what that group of people, what the stakeholders involved in this case, what they think is important, right? And you can usually kind of figure that out just by speaking to them. But some specific things here to think about with communication, and there's a good paper citation in the upper right-hand corner here. Think about, from a behavior analytic perspective, the way that you speak has an effect on your listener, and that can be positive or negative, and that effect is regardless of your intentions. So you could be saying something coming from a very kind place, but if you say it in a particular way, it might be taken by your listener to be not pleasant or negative, right? So in other words, it doesn't matter what you intend, it is how it is received by the listener, right? So you have to think about how you communicate with your stakeholders in your cases. Second consideration here is we all have ways of communicating and speaking with which we feel comfortable. But remember that the point here is not to make ourselves feel comfortable. Our goal is to help our consumers. And so we sometimes have to push ourselves to communicate in ways that are going to make it successful, make our treatment successful in bringing about the type of behavior change that we want, right? Even if it's not the way that we would prefer to communicate. Okay, so Another way that we can promote social validity and assess it is in the selection of treatment goals. So on the left part of this table here, you have to involve all stakeholders in decision making, right? You can't just pick some. You have to think about everybody who has some stake in this case. You have to select objective, measurable, and feasible goals, right? So they have to be measurable in the sense that you know when you've met them, and they have to be feasible, right? They have to be something that is actually you can accomplish given the skill set of your learner and the contextual circumstances and resources. And then you have to select meaningful or socially significant goals. We'll talk more about what that means. But in terms of assessment, this is something that you do at the very beginning of treatment. You're choosing these goals. You need to be collaborating with your stakeholders to say, do you find this valuable? Is this important to you? Can we do this? All of those things are a part of this happens before your treatment even starts. One way that you can do this is a good tool. So this is from Cooper, Heron, and Heward, the Applied Behavior Analysis textbook, 3rd edition, 2020. I've just copied it here, but you can see that there are several domains in which you can sort of assess with your stakeholders whether or not they think the target behaviors that you're selecting are important. So are they dangerous? How many opportunities will the individual have to use this skill in their usual daily environments? Will changing this behavior produce a higher rate of reinforcement, right? So you can use a rating scale like this with your stakeholders to sort of see if they're on the same page with you in thinking that the treatment, the target behaviors that you're selecting and the goals that you're selecting are socially valid. The next place is selection of treatment methods. So again, you want to involve all stakeholders. You want to choose the least invasive treatment methods, right? And we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. And then you want to consider your consumer's environment. So if you're in a home, what are the factors in the home that you need to consider in choosing your method, right? So if there are, let's imagine you're in a classroom. Is an extinction burst acceptable in a classroom? That's a question that you have to ask yourself, right? You have to consider the context in which this is going to happen. And so on the right here, there are a number of assessment activities that you could do to kind of see if this is going to be socially valid. One is like asking stakeholders, does this sound okay to you? Another is to conduct ecological assessments. Go look at the natural environment and think about, like, is this going to be possible? Is this treatment method going to be possible in this environment? And then, as I've mentioned earlier, you need to make sure to be assessing student preferences for treatment methods if you can, right? And in some cases, you just might ask if the kid is able to describe this, like, what do you like about this? What do you not like about this? Even during treatment, they can kind of tell you some things that might make you such that you might be able to tweak it a little bit, right? To make it such that it's better for your learner. They like it better. So there are some general characteristics of treatment methods that make them more likely to be seen as acceptable. One is that they're as simple as possible. I've seen some interventions that behavior analysts have put together that there's so many components to it. It's so complex that nobody can do it, right? And that really complex interventions are bound to be seen as not acceptable. Related to this, interventions tend to be acceptable when they're easy to understand, right? And this is related to number 1. Number 3, they require less time, effort, and resources. And then number 4 is that they work quickly. So all of these things you want to be thinking about. Think about our friend Einstein here. Make everything as simple as possible, which to be effective, but not simpler, right? Selection of treatment outcomes. In terms of promoting social validity, you want to make sure that you're measuring the consumer's behavior across time. And this is a really important thing because you're asking people to change how they interact with your consumer. And in a lot of cases, that's difficult for them. And in a lot of cases, they don't see the changes that are happening. If you've done an intervention, right, usually it takes a little bit of time and consistency to start to be able to see the behavior change. If you're not collecting data, sometimes stakeholders don't see any change in the child's behavior. So you'll be looking at your graphs, and at baseline it was here, and in treatment it's here, right? And that's a significant change for you, but for the parent, maybe they don't see it. And so taking regular measurements, sharing data, treatment updates with your stakeholders, right, help them attend to the subtle changes that are happening through treatment. And then, of course, in terms of, you want to assess opinions of the social significance of outcomes. So you want to ask people, like, do you think this is an important change? And this last one, you want to measure social significance of outcomes for students, right? So that's going to kind of what I'm going to spend the remainder of, well, the next couple of slides here talking about. In the last slide, I mentioned the need to measure social significance. So I want to spend a couple of minutes here talking about the difference between social validity and social significance. So one last time, social validity, right, refers to situations where treatment goals, methods, and outcomes are deemed or considered acceptable and important by stakeholders. When we say that they're deemed or considered acceptable, these are subjective reactions to our treatment goals, methods, and outcomes, right? So it's how people evaluate what we're doing, how they feel about it, what their opinions are. Social significance is a different thing, and it's related to social validity, but it's important to note the difference between them. Social significance refers to the meaningfulness of treatment outcomes to the recipient of services. In other words, it gets at this question, does treatment actually contribute to the well-being of my learner in some way? And a related question involved in social significance is, how can we measure the benefits of treatment to the consumer, right? So we may think it has improved the consumer's life, but did it, A? And then B, if so, can we measure that, right? Because we all have opinions about, oh, this is important for everybody, or this is important for this child. But do you hear that? That is me. That is my opinion about what's important. We need to go beyond that. And so note the important difference between social validity and social significance that I'm suggesting here. Social validity is how people feel about or report feeling about treatment, and that includes ourselves, right, as providers. But social significance is the effects of treatment on the recipient's life or well-being, right? So those are two different things. So if we're saying, okay, social significance is something, it's like, well, what does this do for this client's life? Are there ways to measure it? It's hard, right? It is hard, but here are some suggestions about some suggestions as to how we might measure social significance. One, I've already mentioned in the direct assessment of social validity, normative comparison. So did our treatment make our consumer, our child, make them look more like others, behave more like others in some way? But, right, you have to be careful with these comparisons for the reasons that I mentioned. A second one that we might be able to measure is the amount of new reinforcers consumers can contact or access. So in other words, does our treatment ultimately allow the individual to come into contact with reinforcers to which they didn't have access prior to treatment? Number three, we could measure the number of new environments to which consumers have access. So for example, if we are able to reduce undesirable behaviors to a certain point, does that then allow the consumer to come into contact with other environments to which they had no access before? So community outings. So let's say, for example, like a parent never took their child out to a restaurant or shopping or, to an amusement park because they were worried about problem behavior, interfering, undesirable behaviors. Does our intervention now allow the child to come into contact with those environments when they had no access to them before? A fourth possibility is we could measure the reduction in danger or harm to the consumer or others. So if the behaviors that we're intervening upon are very dangerous or harmful to the person or them or others, to what extent does our intervention decrease the probability of that? A fifth thing that we could measure is the extent to which our treatment increases positive interactions or reduces negative interactions with others. So if you've worked with a child who engages in disruptive behaviors, you see that the individuals around them tend to have a lot of negative interactions with them because of that, right? Usually because the person's behavior is aversive to them. So does our treatment change the valence or the nature of the interactions between them and the people around them? That's an important outcome for that individual as well as the others around them. 6, we could measure the number of other individuals positively impacted by consumer behavior change. So if we are able to change behavior in this way, how many other people around that individual are impacted, right? That we could measure. 7th, we could measure the extent to which the behaviors that we've changed replace or interfere with undesirable behavior. So in other words, when we get rid of undesirable behavior, we have to teach behavior that takes its place. So to what extent does teaching this new behavior get rid of or even replace or keep the old undesirable behavior from coming back or happening again? And then lastly, does treatment allow for the emergence of more complex behaviors? For example, behavioral cusps or pivotal behaviors. So one of the things that you often teach early in intervention for young children with autism is imitation. And so you teach them, do this, do this, do this, right? You teach them to imitate a variety of responses. And sometimes I've had parents ask, like, why are you teaching them to do that? I want them to speak, right? And of course, I understand that. And the reason, though, that you teach imitation is that it provides a means by which you can prompt, different responses. So in other words, a child being able to imitate motor responses in and of itself might not be socially significant, but once the child is able to do that, it allows them to learn some of it. It facilitates the learning of things that are socially significant, like being able to talk. So sometimes you got to start with these behaviors that don't seem socially significant as prerequisites to the teaching of those responses that are socially significant, right? So all of these things are possible ways that we could measure how our treatment is affecting the well-being of our learners in a larger sense. So this being said, why is it important to measure social significance in addition to social validity? Well, there are a couple, one is the main reason is that ABA services involve multiple parties with different motivational circumstances, concerns and wishes. And so the recipient of services, the consumer, has their things that they want, but the caregiver and the family have the things that they want. Schools have things that they want. Community, right? Everybody, funding agencies. So if you're getting money from insurance companies, for example, they're going to want certain things, right? So there are a lot of interests in the service that you're providing, right? You have multiple relationships with these different people. And so in some cases, I'll give you an example where what a parent wanted was maybe not what was best for the child. So for example, there was a parent who wanted their child to play soccer. And so we spent some time teaching some skills related to soccer, and he got in a soccer league. And when they put him out on the field for the first couple of games, it was just very clear that the child had no interest in soccer. And in fact, it was really aversive for him. And so this was a situation where you're looking at, for the child, like, how important is it that for the child that they play soccer? You know, probably not that important, but how important was it for the parents, right? And you see this in schools too. So the schools want the kids to be quiet and not cause any trouble. But you know, it's being quiet is not the same as thriving in the school environment. Or so you have these different parties and stakeholders involved who have different sort of interests in this situation. The reason why I think it's important to measure social significance is your ultimate responsibility as a service provider is to the recipient of your services. So if you're working with an individual with autism, or let's just use that as an example, their family may have concerns, the group home provider may have concerns, right? But the school may have concerns, but your ultimate responsibility as a service provider is to your consumer, right? And so if you think about and measure social significance of your services, it helps to keep you focused on the meaningfulness of what you're doing for your consumer, in addition to the opinions of everybody else about it, right? Because like I said, social validity is important, right, for the reasons we've talked about, but what's more important is that you're doing something good for your client. The last thing I'll mention here is that we have to do more as a field to involve the recipient of services in the measurement of social validity, right? This is because of our past, right? We have come from a place, not just behavior analysis, psychological services more generally, where we decide what's important. We decide what's acceptable. We need to involve our consumers in that. If you've been watching the literature and the news and the things like that, there's a lot of criticism these days of ABA from autism and neurodiversity advocates, saying that ABA takes away personal agency and personal independence and choice. I want to be like this. Why are you trying to change me? Those sorts of things, right? So again, this is a social validity issue. It's and we do need to take it seriously. We do need, and one of the ways we can take it seriously is by making sure our consumers are involved in treatment decisions. And then another reason why this is important is it is coming. There's a rise. One of these articles here on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a rise in this issue of assent-based treatment. So in other words, even if an individual is non-vocal, they can withdraw assent. In other words, they withdraw their sort of willingness to participate. And when they do that, you should not make them do anything. So these are really sticky ethical issues. I think it's really good that we're discussing these things, but at the heart of these issues is this thing of considering what our consumers want and how can we incorporate as much of that preference into what we do as possible while still providing a service that's valuable, right? So as a field, we have to do better in including recipients of service in our treatment decisions. And that means assessing social validity with recipients. right? As much as we can. So at this point, our final self-reflection, I'd like you to think about and ask yourself, is the work I do meaningful for my learners? I think most of us take that for granted, but it's worth thinking about that question. And if the answer is yes, in what way? And then should I or could I measure this somehow? So think about that. Is there some way that you could measure, not just in terms of acquired, mastered responses, but is there some way you could measure the larger impact of what you do for your consumers? So, in closing, main take-home points here. Social validity is an increasingly important part of ABA service delivery. It's more than just consumer satisfaction after the fact, right? Consumer preferences ideally are incorporated into every stage of treatment. Because of this, you should be assessing social validity throughout the treatment process rather than just assuming you have it because treatment is progressing. You should take some time to measure these things along the way. And then lastly, as I just mentioned here at the end, we need more measurement of social significance, which is the meaningfulness of treatment to the recipient of services. So did we teach something because it was convenient for us and something that was easy to teach and add to the mastery list? Or did we teach something that actually had an impact on the life of our consumer? So these are things that need to be considered. This is the end. So thank you for being here with me through all of this. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about issues, you want to talk with anything, you need some articles, please send me an email and I'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Have a great week and enjoy the rest of this course.